The performance review lasts 47 minutes. This is unusual. Most take 15. Marcus sits across from the panel, 3 senior partners at one of the city's oldest architecture firms, and he is perfectly still, not nervous, not uncertain, still in the way that a predator is still. When the lead partner tells him that his latest project, while technically brilliant, has created what she describes as a humanitarian crisis within the team, 12 resignations in 8 months, a junior architect who required medical leave, a culture of fear that has spread across 2 floors. Marcus nods slowly. He says, "That tells me more about them than it does about me." There is no pause before he says it, no flicker of consideration. The partners exchange a look that Marcus does not notice, or perhaps does not register as meaningful. He continues. He explains that mediocrity is allergic to excellence, that the people who left were simply not equipped for the standards required, that the junior architect whose name he does not use had always been fragile. He speaks for 19 minutes without being asked a question. When the lead partner finally interrupts him to explain that the firm will be terminating his contract, something crosses his face, something fast and dark like a shadow moving under ice. And then it is gone. He stands, straightens his jacket, and tells them with complete composure that this is the worst decision they will ever make. He is not threatening them. He genuinely believes it. That is the part that stays with the partners long after he has left the building. He believed it completely. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD, is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as a Cluster B personality disorder, alongside borderline, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. The Cluster B conditions share a common thread: emotional intensity, dysregulation, and patterns of behavior that consistently create friction between the individual and the world around them. NPD is diagnosed when an individual exhibits a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, either in fantasy or in behavior, a chronic need for admiration, and a marked deficit in empathy. The DSM requires that at least 5 of 9 specific criteria be met, and that these traits be stable across time and context, not the result of substance use, another mental illness, or a particular life circumstance. Estimates of prevalence vary, but research suggests NPD affects somewhere between 1 and 5% of the general population. Men are diagnosed at higher rates than women, though researchers debate how much of this reflects actual prevalence versus clinician bias and cultural expectations around gender and entitlement. What makes NPD particularly difficult to study and to treat is that the disorder is egosyntonic. The person experiencing it does not typically feel that something is wrong with them. They feel that something is wrong with everyone else. The grandiosity is not experienced as a defense. It is experienced as an accurate perception of reality. Neurologically, research has pointed toward differences in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for empathy, impulse regulation, and the processing of social feedback. Studies using neuroimaging have found reduced gray matter volume in the left anterior insula in individuals with NPD, an area associated with compassion and the capacity to emotionally resonate with others. The brain of a person with NPD is not broken. It is built differently, optimized, in some sense, for self-preservation at a level most people never have to activate. Marcus was 41 years old when he sat across from that panel, but the architecture of what he had become had been under construction for decades. Marcus grew up in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, the only child of a surgeon father and a mother who had set aside a promising academic career to raise him. By the time he was 7, the family narrative was already established. Marcus was exceptional. This was not delivered as warmth. It was delivered as fact, the way you might tell a child that the sky is blue or that winter is cold. His mother enrolled him in accelerated programs, monitored his friendships for what she called quality, and responded to ordinary childhood failures, a missed goal in soccer, a B on a spelling test, with a particular kind of silence that Marcus learned to read as something worse than anger. His father was largely absent in the way that surgical careers tend to create absence, but when he was present, he offered a different kind of pressure, a cool, evaluative attention that Marcus spent years trying to hold. In school, Marcus was genuinely gifted. He had a spatial intelligence that his teachers found remarkable. He could visualize structures in 3 dimensions at an age when most children were still struggling with basic geometry. He was also socially adept in the way that intelligent, attractive children can be. He understood, instinctively, that he was being watched, and he performed accordingly. He had friends, in the way that satellites have a planet. They orbited him. He did not notice when they drifted away. In his early 20s, he studied architecture at a competitive university on a partial scholarship. His professors described him in the kinds of terms that sound like compliments until you read them again. Relentlessly ambitious, possessed of an almost total confidence in his own vision. He graduated near the top of his class. He was hired immediately. He was, by every external measure, succeeding. But the people who got close to Marcus during those years, and there were some, a college roommate, a woman he dated for nearly 3 years, would later describe a subtle, persistent unease they couldn't quite name at the time, a feeling that they were always slightly peripheral, that their role was to reflect him, and that, when they failed to do so, something cold moved in to replace whatever warmth had briefly been there. It is a clinical misunderstanding to speak of NPD as something that appears. It does not arrive. It assembles, slowly, over years, from the materials a person is given and the gaps they are not allowed to fill. But there are moments when a pattern becomes visible, when behavior that might have seemed like ambition or confidence or high standards begins to reveal its actual shape. For Marcus, one of those moments came when he was 33. He had been at the firm for 7 years. He had produced work that was, without question, significant. He had also, by this point, developed a reputation that traveled in whispers. Junior staff requested reassignment rather than work under him. A colleague who challenged one of his design decisions in a team meeting found herself systematically excluded from subsequent projects, her ideas presented in later meetings without attribution. When a client chose a competing firm's proposal over one of Marcus's, he spent the following week constructing an elaborate and detailed case to anyone who would listen, including senior partners who had not asked, for why the client was incompetent, not disappointed, incompetent. His then partner, a woman named Claire, has since described the texture of those years to a therapist. She said that living with Marcus felt like living in a painting that he had done of the two of them, beautiful from a distance. But if you looked too closely, you realize that only one of the figures had been given any interior detail. She tried to discuss her own needs. He heard it as criticism. She described periods of withdrawal, then extraordinary charm, then withdrawal again. A cycling that she initially attributed to work stress, and later understood as something structural. When Claire ended the relationship, Marcus did not grieve, not visibly. He explained to mutual friends with calm certainty that she had never been capable of understanding what he required. It was the same sentence he used about nearly everyone who left. By his late 30s, the fortress had become isolating even by its own design. The pool of people willing to endure proximity to Marcus had narrowed. He had been passed over for a partnership, a decision the firm attributed to leadership concerns, using language careful enough to be legally defensible. Marcus interpreted this as sabotage. He began documenting what he described as a coordinated effort to undermine him, keeping records of conversations and meetings that, when reviewed later by a therapist, reflected a pattern of selective perception so consistent it was almost architectural in itself. Every slight confirmed the thesis. Every success was his alone. Every failure belonged to someone else. The junior architect mentioned in the opening review, a young man named in the composite records only as D, had come to Marcus as an admirer. D had sought him out, expressed genuine enthusiasm for his work, and spent the first several months of their professional relationship in a kind of voluntary orbit that Marcus found appropriate and natural. But D had his own ideas. When he began to express them, something shifted in how Marcus treated him. The reassignments became punitive. The feedback became, by multiple accounts, targeted and personal in ways that exceeded professional critique. When D took medical leave for what his physician documented as an acute stress response, Marcus told a colleague that D had simply confirmed what he had already suspected about him. He did not ask after him. By the time of the termination meeting, Marcus had not had a sustained personal relationship, professional or otherwise, in over 2 years. He described this, when asked, as a preference. He had simply outgrown the available options. He said this without irony, without any visible awareness that it might be understood as loss. What the termination panel saw in those 47 minutes, and what Claire experienced across those years, and what Dee encountered in a workspace that became untenable, was not simply cruelty, though the outcomes were cruel. It was the operation of a psychological structure that functions with its own internal logic and its own form of suffering that it will never directly acknowledge. The psychoanalytic tradition, from Kohut to Kernberg, has long understood NPD as a disorder of the self, specifically as a failure of what Kohut called the mirroring function. Children develop a stable sense of self partly through being seen accurately by their caregivers, not idealized, not demeaned, but genuinely witnessed. When this process is disrupted, through excessive idealization, through conditional love, through environments where only performance is valued, the child learns to construct a compensatory self, a self that is invulnerable because vulnerability was never safe. The grandiose presentation that is the hallmark of NPD is not the absence of a fragile self, it is the armor over one. What researchers call narcissistic injury, the rage or withdrawal triggered when the grandiose self is challenged, is the crack in that armor and the response to it. Marcus's documentation of perceived slights, his inability to process professional rejection as anything other than sabotage, his instinct to explain away every departure, these were not calculated behaviors. They were the automatic operations of a psyche that had learned at a very early level that the self could only survive if it was never genuinely at risk. The tragedy of NPD is not that the person lacks emotion, it is that the emotion they experience most acutely, shame, inadequacy, the terror of being ordinary, is precisely what the entire structure exists to prevent them from feeling. The armor works, and the armor is the prison. Marcus entered therapy not by choice but by condition. A subsequent firm, smaller and less prestigious than his former employer, agreed to bring him on as a consultant, not a partner, a consultant, on the recommendation of a former colleague who believed in his technical gifts and had agreed informally to serve as a kind of sponsor. The condition, communicated clearly, was that Marcus complete a structured course of psychotherapy. He agreed. He described the decision to his new colleague as strategic. He told his therapist in their first session that he was there because other people had a problem with him and that he wanted to understand why. His therapist, a specialist in personality disorders, noted in her early session records that Marcus presented with complete insight into his intelligence and capability and zero insight into his emotional life. Progress in treating NPD is slow, in part because the disorder resists the vulnerability that treatment requires. Therapeutic approaches that have shown the most promise, schema therapy, transference-focused psychotherapy, work over years, not months, and depend on the patient being willing to encounter the self beneath the grandiosity. For Marcus, that encounter began tentatively around the 8th month of treatment. His therapist documented a session in which he spoke about his father, for the first time at any length, about the evaluative attention, the feeling of being assessed rather than known. He did not cry. He went very still in the way he had been still in the boardroom. But this time, the stillness was different. This time, something was moving under it. He continues in treatment. He has not been promoted at the consulting firm. He has not yet had a sustained personal relationship, but he has, in his therapist's assessment, begun to acknowledge the existence of a gap between who he performs and who he is. Whether he will ever cross it is not something anyone can say with certainty. Most people with NPD never seek treatment at all. What Marcus's case reveals is something unsettling in the most precise sense of that word. It unsettles easy narratives. It is tempting to understand narcissism as a moral failure, as selfishness freely chosen, as something a person simply decided to become. The clinical picture is more complicated. NPD is a disorder that convinces the person who has it that they are the only one in the room who is seeing clearly. It is a prison with mirrored walls. The prisoner sees only themselves and mistakes the reflection for a view. The people around them pay the price for that confusion. And the prisoner, in a way that is both true and insufficient as an explanation, never fully knows what they have lost. That tension, between accountability and understanding, between harm done and suffering hidden, is not resolved here. It shouldn't be. The mind rarely offers resolutions. It offers only the architecture of what it had to build to survive. If you like unsettling psychology, like and subscribe for a new diagnosis each week.